The Opium Wars and their consequences launched China into over 100 years of submission at the hands of the international community. Not only were they forced to accept a harmful and destructive product, but they were also forced to relinquish what would become one of the largest trading centers in the world. Their rights as a country were systematically denied for decades following the wars. China acted out of a responsibility to protect its people from opium, but Britain's abuse of the right to free trade ended up throwing China into a century of oppression.
Opium is derived from the Papaver somniferum plant, also known as the opium poppy, likely cultivated as early as 4000 BCE, called the plant of joy by the Sumerians. Opium spread from Southwest Asia to Egypt, and from there to East Asia along the Silk Road. Opium grows best in dry and warm climates, and as such, most opium is grown in Central Asia. Modern drugs derived from opium include heroin, morphine, codeine, and oxycodone. However, not until the 15th century was opium smoked for pleasure. Its properties as an immensely powerful depressant made it a popular trading commodity by the 17th century. Today, because of its addictive qualities, opium is a Schedule II drug in the United States. Although it has potential medical benefits, the drug's detrimental effects are responsible for irreparable harms in China.
In the mid-1600s, Chinese emperors of the Qing dynasty opened the port of Canton for legal trade with foreigners. This port was controlled exclusively by the Kohong, a group who exercised harsh regulations over foreign traders. Soon, the English East India Company was able to secure a monopoly over Chinese trade. The Kohong set prices on these traders and forbade them from lodging complaints or interacting directly with the Chinese people. By the mid-1830s, tea consumption in Britain had reached staggering levels. By the start of the 19th century, the British imported over 6 million pounds of tea from China's foreign trading port of Canton. The Kohong would only accept silver bullion as payment for this tea, refusing all British goods. In a letter to King George III of Britain, Emperor Qianlong famously said, "We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures." Over a 50-year period, the British exported the equivalent of over 27 million British pounds of silver into China.
In 1773, the English East India Company was able to secure a monopoly over Indian opium production. They began marketing opium to Chinese citizens through illegal merchants. Soon after, in 1796, a ban was placed on opium sale and use in China, but this ban had little effect on the widespread use and popularity of the drug. The English East India Company's loss of their monopoly over opium in 1819 and the loss of their trading monopoly in 1833 led to the export of larger and larger amounts of opium into China. In 1838, Britain exported 40,000 chests of opium. During the same time frame, the Chinese exported 9,000 pounds of silver to supply this opium trade. In 1838, Lin Zexu was appointed to the position of Chinese Imperial Commissioner of Canton. Emperor Daoguang assigned Lin to this position with the intention of reducing the amount of opium being exported into China. In Lin Zexu's famous letter to Queen Victoria, he asked,
"The great profit made by British traders is all taken from the rightful share of China. By what right do they, in return, use the poisonous drug to injure the Chinese people? Even though the barbarians may not necessarily intend to do us harm, yet in coveting profit to an extreme, they have no regard for injuring others. Let us ask, where is your conscience? I have heard that the smoking of opium is very strictly forbidden by your country. That is because the harm caused by opium is clearly understood. Since it is not permitted to do harm to your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to the harm of other countries. How much less to China?"
Lin's letter never reached the Queen, and his appeal to the conscience of the British Crown was lost. In 1839, Lin confiscated all the opium possessed by British traders near Canton. Charles Elliot, superintendent of British trade in China, attempted to negotiate with Lin, who responded to this request by holding all British merchants in Canton hostage. Eventually, Elliot commanded the opium traders to hand over the British opium supplies to Lin, who tossed all 9 million silver dollars worth of opium into the ocean. The British responded to this destruction of property by sending ships to China.
The British Navy was incredibly large and very powerful. At the time of the war, they had an unofficial two-power standard. This dictated that the number of warships owned by the country must be greater than the amount owned by the next two powers combined. These warships were expertly built and well armed. 48 ships carrying near 4,000 men were involved in the war right from the start. By the end of the war, 12,000 British troops were involved. Additionally, Great Britain was in possession of the Nemesis. The 660-ton warship was the first iron warship, referred to as the Devil Ship by the Chinese. She was armed with a rocket launcher, two 32-pounder and four 6-pounder guns. The ground forces employed by the British were predominantly from India, a British colony at the time. These sepoys were Hindus and Muslims recruited by the British. Irish and Scottish troops were also a part of the military forces. The Chinese forces were considerably less well organized. Their naval power was limited to a collection of war junks, wooden boats that were easily destroyed by well-placed British fire. The Chinese ground forces were ill-equipped and untrained, and the Cantonese militias that rose up, armed only with spears and hoes, were no match for the well-disciplined British. On November 3, 1839, two British warships confronted a group of Chinese war junks. 15 Chinese men were killed in this confrontation, as opposed to only one British injury. Shortly after this battle, Charles Elliot requested reinforcements, and on January 31, 1840, British authorities in India officially declared war on China. In June of that year, the reinforcements requested finally came. They included 16 warships, 4 steamers, 27 transports, and 1 troop ship. This put Commissioner Lin in a tough position. He had to defend Canton, severely outmatched and outnumbered. The British forces decided to avoid attacking Canton head-on, so they set up a naval blockade and moved north with the remainder of their forces. Their goal was to get their message to Peking. On the way up, they captured a few Chinese port cities. Back south, a short battle was waged near Macau. It was another decisive victory for the British. Shortly after, the British spoke to the Emperor in Peking, and Commissioner Lin was fired for his incompetence and inability to defend Canton. The Emperor said, "Externally, you wanted to stop the opium trade, but it has not been stopped. Internally, you wanted to wipe out the outlaws, but they are not cleared away. You are just making excuses with empty words. Nothing has been accomplished, but many troubles have been created. Thinking of these things, I cannot contain my rage." His successor, Kishan, began to negotiate a deal with Charles Elliot. Unfortunately, it fell through, and the following naval battle came to live in infamy. Over 500 Chinese men were killed, and not a single British man died. Unfortunately for Charles Elliot, the British were not happy with his relaxed policies either. He was fired as well. In July of 1841, his successor Henry Pottinger arrived. Despite the change in command, British dominance remained, and the war continued in this very unequal fashion until 1842. In July of that year, the last major battle of the war was fought in Qinqiang. The fighting force of 7,000 British men crushed the 3,000 Chinese men in opposition. With the conclusion of this battle, the path to the major city of Nanking lay open, and the Chinese realized that they had lost. The war finally ended in the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. The treaty dictated that China was required to pay 21 million silver dollars in compensation and relinquish the port city of Hong Kong to the British Crown. In addition, the Chinese had to open 5 port cities, Canton, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, up to foreign trade. Following the signing of the treaty, a number of other Western countries signed similar treaties with the Chinese. For example, the United States signed the Treaty of Wangzhou, and France signed the Treaty of Whampoa with the Chinese. These Western nations received benefits similar to those found in the Treaty of Nanking from these treaties. The influx of foreign goods was damaging for much of the domestic industry of China. Some markets, such as tea and silk, flourished, increasing 500 and 2,800% respectively. However, most others suffered greatly due to low or no demand for Chinese-made goods.
During the First Opium War, Britain defended their aggression towards China by claiming the right to free trade. However, by endangering the lives of millions of Chinese citizens, they completely overstepped this right. The Chinese government acted solely on their responsibility to protect its people, and as such, the British are at fault for the consequences of the Opium Wars.